analysis of historic buildings, and is a consultant on conservation-related matters. Addyman Archaeology specialise in buildings archaeology, and this extends to a range of survey methods from detailed hand recording to advanced digital techniques. And tonight, Tom is going to be talking about Fairburn Tower, recent analysis and investigation. So over to you, Tom.
Brilliant. I'm just doing the share. Right, is that correctly on the screen? Kirsty, can you give me a thumbs up? Or, yes, okay.
Yeah, that's good, yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, if I'm ready to go, I'll go. Well, it's a great honour this evening to be talking to the Highland Archaeology Festival, albeit a virtual festival, which is all very exciting and not what any of us would have wanted, but it does give an opportunity possibly for more people to come and attend from further afield. So there are pros and cons. This project at Fairburn Tower is one we've been involved in for since 2017, and as you can see there, it's a landmark trust. It's a landmark trust project that has been in gestation for a number of years, focusing on the ruined tower house at Fairburn, which is a little outside of Muirvord, some 15 kilometres to the northwest of Inverness, on a lovely sort of elevated sort of plateau type site. The tower itself is remarkably well preserved, if as you can see here with that great crack going up the front, slightly precarious, hanging on to its existence. The crack in particular causing sort of great concern for the long-term sort of future of this particular ruin. So the Landmark Trust, recognising the significance of this as a particularly fine building, a wonderful survival, and as you will see later on, containing some fairly extraordinary features. I mean, it's a very good example of its type, and for various reasons, such as those, the tower was thought to be a very good candidate for restoration, and that is the project that's proceeding. It's been generously financed by Historic Environment Scotland, and also by a number of private donors and individuals who very generously sort of raised the considerable funds required to fully restore the tower, put a roof back on, and turn it into a landmark trust lettable property. The project is being overseen by Simpson & Brown Architects in Edinburgh, which is the other part of my firm. I'm Addyman Archaeology, working with them. So, as with all projects like this, I'm going to take you, well, firstly, I'm going to take you through our experience of our work there, and primarily on the archaeological side. It's a slightly odd process, and an apology to begin with. When we first planned this talk, we were expecting to be considerably further ahead with it, with the research and with the archaeological involvement on site, but obviously COVID intervened and the entire project has been delayed, and we're just only now getting back onto site with safe access established and so on. So it's really a state of the moment on this project, where we got to up to the COVID shutdown. But that had been, as I said, part of a process that had been going on for a number of years, and in 2016 some of the first research was done on the historical sources for the tower by Malcolm Banger Jones and also Caroline Stanford of Landmark. A whole series of sources were examined, and I'm not going to go into it in a great level of detail. This could be a talk about Clan Mackenzie, but suffice it to say that the tower owes its origin to Murdoch Mackenzie, who was first established on the lands at Fairburn in 1539 and formally granted the land in 1542. So we think the existing building, whether there was something earlier on site, we don't know, but the existing structure dates to probably the early 1540s, and had a sort of complex subsequent evolutionary history, as you'll see. Of various historical sources. The William Roy plan of the mid-18th century shows quite a developed landscape and shows the site, but not in a great deal of detail. These estate plans that you can see also show very much what Roy sort of hints at, a series of enclosures, rectilinear enclosures, with the castle site at the heart of this landscape, and this is up on a high ridge with wonderful views to the south in particular. And you can see here, even in this early 19th century pair of estate plans, it was the tower, which is this piece here, is part of a courtyard complex, and that would be a very sort of typical arrangement for a sort of low or medium status sort of tower house with surrounding orchards, gardens, enclosures, and so on. By the time of the first edition Ordnance Survey, this is a 25-inch of the 1870s, you can see the tower is ruined. There's a cottage on the side. Some of these other buildings have already disappeared, and there are other little sort of enclosures and minor structures visible. McGibbon and Ross in the 1880s did the first survey of the building that we know about, and with the help of a local architect as well, who sent plans, and they did a basic phase plan. And the very obvious thing to say is, in terms of its evolution, the stair tower is an addition, and that's clearly shown here. So that's a stair tower. You can see it very much looks like it's stuck onto an earlier building. So some basic sort of facts of the tower's history were known. This is our earliest photographic image, circa 1880, and a fantastic image showing the tower in splendid isolation, with the cottage that still survives as a ruin on its side, but at that stage still retaining its thatched roof. And you can see that there's two chimneys, and here there's an internal cross wall, and you'll see the remains of the fireplace in a slide later on. If you just bear that in mind, by the beginning of the 20th century, the cottage was beginning to become derelict, and by the mid-century, half of it had already gone, and the thatched roof on the other side of it had been covered in crinkly tin zinc roof. But very much both the tower and the cottage were derelict, completely roofless by the 1950s. A later agricultural building was built up against the side. This collapsed probably about 10 years ago or so, and so we're dealing really with the ruin of the cottage today and the tower itself. So what have we been doing? After the history, we did an assessment of the building in 2017, which was an initial look over as access permitted, and it's not a safe building, and so we had to be very careful with what we saw, and we didn't get into many areas. That led on to a building recording exercise, and so I'll take you through our sort of methodology and what we've been doing at Fairburn. As the introduction said, we use a combination of techniques, and this isn't Fairburn, but this is very much what we do. This is Kenny, and we do a great deal of detailed hand recording on site. So this is measured survey, very, very sort of basic and low level, but it does force you to really look into a building visually and define what you're drawing, whereas digital techniques don't do that. So it's a good basic discipline. This is at Craigie Castle. In terms of digital techniques, so it's a combination of techniques to best effect, and focusing them on the subject, using whichever one works best effectively. So here we have Craigie Castle, we did a few years ago, with coloured sort of laser scan imagery to create a three-dimensional model, and that's to act as a survey control. Given that you can't just put a tape measure up 6 stories, you need some way of controlling your images, and from that you can generate two-dimensional projections. And so these are both scans. One is grayscale and the other has the colour. You can cut out the colour and you can actually see the form of the structure that you're surveying much more clearly if without the distraction of colour. And then that can be used as a dimensionally accurate basis for surveying onto. We've also at Fairburn and at Craigie used digital modelled photography. This at both sites involved using a drone to take basically stereo photography, stereo pair photography from high level all around the building, put it all into a computer, and it creates a three-dimensional digital photographic model of the structure, which is an incredibly powerful tool, particularly where you can't get to roofs and the upper parts of a ruin without scaffolding. So at Fairburn, this is one of the elevations of many that was generated from the laser scan data. So this is the grayscale data of the back of the tower, which we then use as a basis for our survey work. And I'll take you through a few of these. It's an incredibly powerful tool. So this is a complete model inside and out of the tower using scan data. This is the hall, the first floor plan. And basically with this model, you can cut slices at any point through the building. And so here you can see a cut through of the stair tower. These are latrine closets. That's a former stair, and so on. You can see all the fireplaces and so on. And as you go up through the building, you can just cut a horizontal slice. So floor by floor, that's second floor. You can see the different chambers, third floor. And these are all perfectly lined up above each other. And there's the wall heads, and you can see the bartizan turrets at the very top, and another fireplace. The top of the stair tower had a little cap house. And you can just see how incredibly easy and useful this is as a tool to survey a building. And bear in mind, it's a dangerous structure, so physically you're not even getting near it in order to collect this data. There they are in sequence, one above the other. The digital modeled photography allows you to do 2D projections. And so here that's the front of the tower and one side. When you zoom in, you can see every tiny stone and pebble and weed growing out of the wall, which you can literally trace and turn into a drawing. And it gets really fun when you have this modeled imagery for the interior as well. You can do slice throughs vertically and horizontally in any direction you wish. So we've actually had a great deal of fun with this survey, but you can immediately see how complex a building it is and how many mural chambers and fireplaces and windows and so on. So I think the actual survey on site with all of this digital was only a few days, and we used it to generate very detailed drawings. And so this is an example of the elevation done from photographic modelling, and then literally tracing it off. And you can see the sorts of things we're looking at. These are historic surfaces, lime finishes that survive, the individual stones, the principal features. And as you stare at it more and more and look on site, you can pick up different phases. And so we know the stair tower is an addition, but we quite rapidly just worked out that the top part of the tower was another addition. So the original parapet was built off, and they built an entire additional story on top of the building. And so we're colouring those phases, and you can very easily and quickly communicate the history of the building by doing that. And so you've got this original tower, which is the Mackenzie of Fairburn Tower from the 1540s. We think the stair tower, the bartizans and the cap house were all added in the early 17th century. And then a whole series of later things, early windows got blocked up and so on. And you can see here, this was the agricultural shed which had collapsed, but left a scar on the side of the building. And here we are sort of systematically going through the evidence, both to try and create a formal record of the building for posterity, to really understand its evolution, and a lot of this information is then fed into the conservation sort of planning process and information that the architects will take forward. And they've used these drawings as a basis for their own drawings. So it's all quite an integrated procedure. Again, cutting through the inside, here's an example of our drawing on the inside. And you can immediately see just how complex these features are and how densely packed they are into what externally looks like a very simple building. But inside there's all sorts of things going on. And we haven't even physically got access to it yet, so scaffold hasn't got up to the interior. So there's still a huge amount to learn, even though these look like detailed drawings, they're not finished. And again, I'm going to zoom in on one or two features and illustrate the sort of information we're beginning to get out of the tower. by looking at one or two things. So I said the top floor had been added with the little bartizans, and from below you can actually see what looked like a windowsill. And as we got up there, that's what you can see from below. And that could be quite important if it were wished to restore that feature, for example. And so it's quite useful to get up there and know about it very quickly. So the drone imagery allows you to look down on it, and that's what we saw from above. And very clearly you can see that, obviously, the bartizan in the corner, which we can't get access to until the scaffolding is up, and then the window itself, and you can just also see the bar sockets, the jamb of the window, and the impression of where the other side of it was. And you can get sort of measured information without even getting physical access. Another feature that we saw from below, which we're very interested in getting up to see in close detail, you can just see those two stones sticking out. And we know that the top of the building was rebuilt, but this is the very top of the original. And we think that's been cut off, and it's probably a guardrabe, a toilet, from the parapet level. So you'd go up for a very fresh air toiletry experience on the back of the building there. And we think that was cut off when they rebuilt the upper level. So there are fascinating little details everywhere you look. I apologise for the quality of this image. You can see the rain pouring down. We've had a lot of questionable weather. This is another good example, but it does also show the absolute quality of what's going on in this building, and that's one of the most striking things, and why Landmark were particularly interested in this tower house opposed to many other tower houses. The sheer design quality of it as a building, and you can just see the fireplaces, aumbrys, window recesses, window seats, all sorts of incredible details, absolutely packed into what looks like a very plain building on the exterior. I'm not going to go into this in huge detail because there's so much, but you can see here within the wall there's the remains of a circular staircase, and that was destroyed when they decided to build the stair tower, and they knocked these entrances through in order to access the new stair on the outside of the building. But originally we had a different stair arrangement. So at lower level we had a turnpike stair, a spiral stair, which got you up to second floor level. And then there was an entrance here, which led up in a straight flight to the next floor up, and in through that doorway there. Now this all got blocked off, but you can see B in the middle is actually a little window into that stair. So behind that walling, and destroyed by these later entrances, is the original stair arrangement. And so there are things like this all through the building. It's a very complex structure. Very briefly, that shows the sort of evidence in plan for that. It's a very finely detailed building, and quite remarkable in its design in a number of aspects. And at basement level, you have this vaulted cellar, which is still intact, and on each wall there are three recesses, each with a gun port, a small gun port. And one of the most extraordinary things is this timber seating, which is for an arquebus or a small cannon gun, basically a swivel gun. And this is an incredibly rare survival, so it just sort of shows what does survive at Fairburn. Little details like that tell you so much. Here's a scan, but in plan you can just see the arrangement of gun ports. So this is an unusually large number for a very small tower house. There are three on each side, incredibly scientifically planned. Murdoch Mackenzie was a courtier, and although he wasn't rich, he was very much in touch with the latest ideas about armament and defence and quality of construction, and all of this appears at Fairburn, which is another reason why it's so remarkable. Hamilton of Finnart was the cousin of the king and very much in touch with Renaissance ideas of fortification, and there's every likelihood Murdoch Mackenzie would have been very aware of these principles coming in. here we are. So this is the incredible array of gun ports at ground level, shooting out from the basement, and some variation in detail. And you can see coming around the side, and also elsewhere there are pistol loops all over the place. This is the stair, inside the stair going down to the cellar, and it's got pistol loops all the way down, and you just see one here, the stairs going down there. That's from the inside. So fascinating details, lots of very subtle details as well, separating out mason's marks from the original construction from the 1540s, and then obviously later graffiti as well. All of these things tell you little bits about the history of the building in different ways. We had a great concentration on the building materials. It's very interesting because it embodies field stone, sandstone that's imported, slabs of more local stone tying in a huge amount of geological information there, a lot of it very sort of local, but some imports. There are fantastic surviving remains, I mean, absolutely remarkable, of the original surface finishes, a whole sequence of different layers of lime application, rough cast harls, and internally as well. In some areas, the internal wall plaster still survives. So a huge amount of detailed information, some of which has already been assessed and appears in a gazetteer, a technical paper by Historic Environment Scotland. So whizzing through, I'm sorry, there's so much to say and so little time, so I'm going to keep going very fast. The cottage, which at the moment isn't part of the main recording exercise, is also a fascinating building. We think it dates to around about 1700 or thereabouts. As you saw in that early photograph, it had 2 chambers and 2 chimneys. And it's a funny hybrid building because you've got evidence for cruck frames, a very sort of vernacular form of construction. These slots are for sort of pairs of timbers that met at the apex, supporting the thatched roof. So you think of a fairly vernacular sort of construction, but then it has a fireplace like this, which is a great, beautifully built kitchen fireplace with a graceful arch. So in the latter history of the tower's laird occupation by the Mackenzie lairds, they had built this as a new kitchen outside the main tower. Moving on, in terms of the archaeology, the excavation, clearly there'll be the conservation work will require all sorts of access arrangements and ways of getting to the tower, services and bringing water and electricity to the tower and so on, and a whole series of below ground requirements that might reveal archaeological remains. And so part of the project is what's below ground as well as what's above ground. So you can see this scaffolding that's been put up. There was some suggestion that cobbling or other remains might survive around the base of the tower. So we did a little investigation where the proposed scaffolding was to go, and a very odd sort of archaeology where we did a grid of trenches and very rapidly discovered very extensive remains of cobbling in most areas. Clearly a well-preserved, probably courtyard cobbled surface. A little bit about the conditions. The site is quite damp, and a lot of this work was done in February this year, just as the weather turned bad. And so we had a pretty miserable time of it, including flooding, and a lot of the topsoil just turned into liquid. So it was a thoroughly unpleasant, as you can see, an unpleasant experience. And it was decided to clean off these cobbles. Here we are. Here's my colleague Alice, who's having a time of her life in the snow, digging away. Kenny sort of hoovering mud off cobbles. But as it happens, if you clean mud off and polish the cobbles, you can get an amazing result. And so this is what it ended up. Basically, fortunately, we had a dry spell and all the mud dried off, and we were able to clean the cobbling. And an absolutely spectacular survival of a courtyard surface. You can see this is sort of looking eastwards along the front of the tower. There's a stair tower. And you can see the beautiful sort of individual panels. Cobbling was laid in panels. And there it is from the tower looking down. And we think that there was probably an entrance up on this side. The tower is at the bottom, and you sort of were encouraged to come into the courtyard here and then round to the tower. And so I think the cobbling is encouraging direction of movement, but also cobbling stops. And we think there were structures around the courtyard at the point where the cobbling stops. But you can also see there's a lot of damage in some areas, so it's not a complete picture. We did digital modelling of this in order to generate a plan, and there's a plan. It's a thankless task drawing cobbles, particularly I think we counted, you can digitally quantify it. I think we got to something like 5,000 cobbles or something like that. But you can see here very clearly the different panels of the cobbles, and some interesting patterns. I said that was the entrance, probably because it seems to be bounded by walls, and whether there was a gatehouse in this area. But you're encouraged to come in here, and then you have this particular panel which seems to splay open towards where we think, well, we know the original entrance before they put the stair tower was here. So I think this may have encouraged you to a timber stair up to the stair tower entrance, up to the tower house entrance at first floor level. And you can just see the arrangement of panels. So I'm going to keep going because I'm running out of time. But again, as a set piece of tower house planning, this is obviously very much as much of the site as the tower itself, and a wonderful survival. Other things that we're doing on site, in all sorts of different soil investigations. This is along a route for proposed services. We're just testing to make sure the service won't be damaging something like this. So if there are more cobbles now, we'd have to look very carefully about where to put services. So a whole series of trenches within the wider site. On the north side, which is against the back of the cottage here, not a great deal in terms of significant archaeology. No cobbled surfaces, for example, and this is clearly out with the main courtyard area. Another grim photo. And some of these trenches digging in waterlogged conditions, so the cobbling peters out as you go southwards, and here we have a footing of what must be a structure. So I'm not going to get into all of that in great detail, but and because this really is a state of the moment, and this is our current sort of thinking sketched out of what it all means. We haven't got much further than this, but it's that last trench picked up a wall footing here, and some of those early estate plans show a structure at that point, so that seems to tally fairly well. And this may be a gated entrance and bounded by structures on either side. So that's just the sort of thinking about the early form of this compound. So going forward, we were just going up on the 23rd of March for the next big tranche, when the Prime Minister made his the next big tranche of work. The Prime Minister made his announcement, and we sort of had to do a U-turn and come back again, and the entire country was locked down. And so that was the moment when the project halted. Really, it's only now just starting to sort of open up again, and we were hoping to get back onto site early August, and we discovered in our absence during lockdown, you can just see a bird up here, barn owls moved into the tower, and so that stopped, delayed work certainly until September. 3 barn owl chicks here. Cameras were put in, monitored every week or so, waiting for them to fledge and flip the nest. By early September, 2 of the 3 chicks had gone, but you can see down here the last chick still very much in residence until mid-September, a sort of stay-at-home teenager who just didn't want to go. But finally the chick has gone, and we now have access to site, so things will begin quite soon. So sorry, just to finish off and conclude, it's an ambitious project. It's a brave thing to take on. Every time I come and look at this stair tower, the crack looks worse, but it has been stabilised, and the scaffolding is now been taken around it, and it's what was an incredibly sort of scary prospect. And the building is now beginning, it's fully scaffolded, and the initial repairs and further recording work will be possible very soon. This was June last year. This is a sponsors and patrons event at the tower, and this project, would not be possible without a lot of very, very generous support from government and from private individuals and donors. And so a big thank you from everybody involved to them. And I just leave you with this amazing image of a winter's day at Fairburn. I think I should stop there and ask for questions. Thank you very much indeed.
That was brilliant. Thanks very much, Tom. So we're looking for some questions now. I just had a quick one myself. Well, I actually say I was on site. It looked a bit like that, and I want to say your cobbles look beautiful because it was an absolute swamp up there.
Yes,
So the photos are amazing. I love a clean bit of stonework. But my quick question was, how late is too late? I mean, that crack looks horrible. I mean, could this have fallen down at any time, or is it a bit more stable than it looks, do you think?
Well, I never felt it looked stable.
Okay.
But, we have some very good engineers who, have been monitoring it very carefully, and some minor movement. Really, I mean, that crack was visible at the time of McGibbon and Ross in the 1880s, and there's a sort of hint of it on their drawing. So it really has been there for a long, long time. It formed, basically the tower is sort of splitting sideways, and it was because somebody in their wisdom decided to rob the spiral staircase of all of its stair treads, which were the things that were holding the tower together. It's like sort of almost undoing a zip. They robbed it for lintels in farm buildings and so on. And so there was nothing actually to tie the tower together. And so the proposed work is to reinstate the staircase and use that as a means of stitching the tower back to itself, holding it together again, which is quite an elegant sort of structural solution, reinstate what was there. So, but yes, I mean, I didn't mind getting close to it.
Okay, but do you think that sort of as long as there's a structure there, no matter how badly cracked, that it's possible to bring it back to life, to mend it? I mean, I'm thinking of maybe Castle Craig on the Black Isle. It's got a similar horrendous crack, and I always thought, again, that's beyond. But I know there's plans, I think, to.
Yeah. But that's sort of 2/3 of the tower. So one whole wall has collapsed.
Yeah.
The remarkable thing about this is, it managed to stay up long enough for it to be saved. No, I can't believe 2 or 3 gales might have brought this down. So it's been saved in the nick of time. So and I think it's a very good thing to have done.
That's great. Thank you. Now, can I go to Andy or Ian? Are you kind of compiling some questions for us? Have you got any coming in?
Yes, we've had a few questions coming in. The first one, I think it will combine. There's a similar question from Nick Lindsay and also Anne. It's what is the objective of the project? So what's going to happen to the building once it's conserved? Another Nick also adds what was the cost? I mean, I don't know if we can go into the detail of how much it's all costing, but what are the plans for the building? I
think cost-wise, as it's a landmark, I think things will be in the public domain, but I think it would be indiscreet of me to say so. But sorry, what was the other part of the question?
What's the objective of the project? So what's the intention for the building?
Well, it's to fully restore the tower, put its floors back in, roof back on, replaster the interior, get all the access back, furnish it, and have it as available as a lettable property. And you'll probably have seen other landmark properties. So it's the watchword is a precious historic building that is brought back and rescued, brought back from the brink, and given a new life. And it's very, very possible for Fairburn. The evidence of how it looked, there's very, very good evidence for most aspects of how it was. So it's not so much a speculative restoration. It's based on a lot of detailed study, which is partly why we're going into such detail ourselves. Yeah.
think linked to that is another question. So what is the timeline in terms of the design work, the building and the opening? I mean, obviously things have been put back quite a bit, but obviously by the COVID-19 situation. But so what's the timeline now, I suppose?
Well,
what was it originally? What's it now?
Gosh. Well, I'm mainly involved in the earlier stages, so I wasn't actually quite sure when the great opening was going to be. The major works will be happening throughout next year, and I suspect the roof will be on by the end of next year. So I think it's the year after that will be achieved. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done in the interim.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We've got another question here, sorry, from Jonathan Wordsworth. Do you think the cobbling is original with the construction, or more likely a replacement through the history of occupation?
It's a good question. We've thought about quite a great deal. I think it currently we think it is sort of mid 16th century cobbling. It seems to respect the original stair arrangement, which was superseded by the stair tower. The stair tower seems to have impacted it. I mean, you can pick up cobbling and relay it and do it very neatly, so it's a little bit difficult to tell sometimes. But I think we're fairly clear that it is part of the original layout, which is fascinating because the edging of the cobbling defines the positions of buildings that are now gone and don't even appear in the historical record. So I think remains to be seen if we'll get to a broader area, but I suspect we'll get more remains of those surrounding buildings as well. But yeah.
The kind of cobbles respected the surrounding buildings. What about all the panelling? Do you know what that was all about?
As in the individual panels of cobbles?
Oh, the kind of the ones you numbered, and there were small rectangles. And was it just the design, or was there a purpose to that?
Well, that's a really good question. We've been pondering that, trying to make some sort of sense of it. And I think that causeway coming in, I mean, that's probably where the historic routeway always was, to the east. And so it makes perfect sense. There was some sort of an archway, or possibly even a gatehouse of some sort there. That leads you into the centre of the cobbled area, and then you've got that splayed cobbling, which draws the eye to the tower. And I think it's sort of obviously respecting the principal approach to the tower. What the other panels mean is, or if there is a meaning, it may just be how they were laid. But the ones on the south side are certainly coarser, so they're much rougher cobbles laid in panels than the ones immediately in front of the tower. So there's certainly some differentiation between it, between the different parts of the. So we're trying to make of it what we can. There are quite a number of cobbled surfaces that survive at other castle sites people will be aware of. And so there will be an interesting study there to compare them. Edsall Castle, for example, has fantastic cobbling, and many other sites. So there's a cobbling dissertation to be done there.
Yeah, we've had quite a wee kind of comment here. It says, could it be stabling? Could it be representing sort of stables and actually having a building over it, perhaps?
Well, we didn't find. I mean, if you're thinking of a building sort of supported by sort of timber posts that was open on one side, definitely a possibility, although we did not see any seatings for vertical posts anywhere. It doesn't mean the post couldn't rest on top of the cobbles. And I suppose if so, we'll never know, because the evidence wouldn't remain. I think when we've got to the end of a project, we can come back to that and see what we've concluded.
Okay, we've got quite a few more questions, so I'm just going to rush through them maybe. So was there a generic design for these towers, or was each one bespoke?
That's a difficult question. Basically, the answer is yes and no. There's a whole sort of continuum of tower houses and how they were designed. They were very much influenced by regional variation and geological local resources. And so they can look quite different. Aberdeenshire, for example, has very often rounded, cornered towers because the available stone, they didn't have great sources of sandstone to put sharp corners on, and it was easier with the granite just to put a rounded corner on. Basically, the function also related to status and the wealth of the individual and the landholding. And so some were much more ambitious than others. This, I think you would say, is a modest tower and scale, but quite ambitious in its architectural pretension, particularly when you get inside. It's absolutely beautifully built, and it's it's quite a remarkable structure. Everyone is different, and I think the debate will go on endlessly as to what it all means.
So quickly, Ian, did we have any more questions coming in there?
I think. Oh yes, there was one from Richard. There's a obviously townhouses are quite a feature of Scottish landscape. Does there seem to be a generic design for towers, or is there a bespoke design for each one?
Well, you have clients and you have master masons, and they all have different experiences and different ideas, and there's great regional variation. This one seems to be a very considered design. There are aspects of the defence, the gun ports at the bottom. That's quite unusual. It seems to be a very clear system, and it's a very difficult question to answer because every location is different as well, and they're dealing with a whole range of factors. And so some towerhouses are hugely ambitious. Great. Borthwick, for example, is very, very complex, somewhat earlier, but it's an astonishing structure. And then you get incredibly simple ones at the other end of the scale. And sometimes you don't really even know it's a tower house because they didn't get around to putting anything that looks like a battlement. It's a tall house. And so really think of these things more as houses rather than castles or even tower houses. It's a tall house. And certainly by the 17th century, you have the trappings of a tower, turrets and so on. Sometimes they're not even functional. It's the idea of a castle rather than it actually being a castle. And it's more of a comfortable tall house. And they never or very rarely existed in isolation. And so the whole courtyard and compound and associated buildings that accompanied at least 90% of these structures, very often, mostly they don't survive. And so, to consider these buildings in isolation is definitely unwise, because they always had associated settlements, landscapes, enclosures, associated buildings, and so on. So it's basically the heart of a small sort of landed enterprise, usually.
Could I just come in and just throw one more in there, Kirsty, before you move on? So one last question from Duncan Kennedy, which is quite an interesting one. He says there seems to be an unusually high number of gun loops for this type of structure. Are these likely to have been purely for their defensive use, or were they mostly ornamental? And just as a quick follow-up to that, did you have a favourite barn owl? Rachel asks.
Well, I can empathise with a stay-at-home teenager barn owl, but I'll say no more than that for fear of getting into trouble. What was the first part of that?
It was about the gun loops. Do you think they were ornamental, or were they actually genuinely defensive? Well,
I think in this case both. I mean, they're quite serious gun loops, and the mouth is something like 15 centimeters, 10 to 15 centimeters in diameter, and they are sort of scientifically organised to give the maximum field of fire. And it doesn't get more as sophisticated as this in tower houses generally. There are a few that have many more. But obviously the outward look as well is very intimidating, so you wouldn't feel like approaching it unless you were a friend. Yes, I mean it was very much for show as well, but in this case, it was probably quite defensible, and all the pistol loops going up the staircase and so on. So yes, I mean it's definitely both, and in most cases it was both. You would think twice before knocking on the front door.
That's great. Thanks very much. We actually have one. Is it possible to have one last question? So I know everyone's hanging on for the next talk, but the question is from Kathy Dagg, and it's about: are there similarities or comparisons with Ardwick Castle? What do you think about that? Briefly, do you think?
Well, this I think is slightly earlier. I might be wrong on that, but what's interesting there is the stair tower is integral to the tower itself, whereas this is a slightly simpler design where the stair tower is a later addition. So yes, there is a contrast between the two. I think what happened to Fairburn with the increasing, well, basically they added the stair tower to make it a more convenient house to live in, and they added the upper story to give better accommodation. So they were trying to improve the living arrangements, and so I think Ard Vrek is slightly later, and it's at a time when those improvements are sort of embedded into a building much more, and so it's a very good example of a later towerhouse where comfort is beginning to take over from security. Yeah. Thank
you. That's brilliant. I just want to say thanks very much, Stuart, for coming and answering all our questions tonight and managing to get everything working. I know this is a brilliant site that a lot of people have their eye on, and they're all looking forward to seeing it restored, and perhaps even getting to go and visit it when it's completed, whenever that may be. So thanks a lot, Tom, and we're going to move on to the next talk now, which is Dr. Graeme Cavers of AOC Archaeology. Graeme's head of survey and geomatics at AOC, and his work has focused on the development of survey techniques and 3D technology, and his research interests lie in the later prehistoric of northern Britain. Graeme has worked a lot in Highland. I'm sure many of you have worked with him. He's worked on community focused projects like in Lutz and Caithness on the Broch sites, and at Clachtall Broch in Sutherland as well. So here we are tonight. It's Graeme talking about LiDAR survey in the Highlands, future prospects for 3D mapping and landscape archaeology.
Thanks, Kirsty. Tom, I think I may need you to unshare your screen. Okay. Let's see. Oops.
That's looking good.
Yeah, can you see that? Okay.
Yep, perfect.
Okay, good. Right, so yeah, thanks for having me, everyone. I'm just gonna, what I want to do tonight is really just gonna give an overview of where we are with LiDAR survey in Scotland generally, and what I was asked to talk about was really about the directions that it might take us in the future, and how that applies to, or might be applied in the Highlands. I've been working with laser scanning in general for about 15 years now, and with aerial LiDAR for about 10, and really the pace that these things develop at is quite frightening, and it really does feel like we're sort of moving into a new generation of archaeological survey. So it's a good kind of point to kind of reflect on where we're headed with all of this, and how this might impact on how we do archaeology generally. Oops, let me see. Let's make sure I'm doing the right thing. Yeah, okay. So I think it's probably not too much of an exaggeration to think about this as something of a paradigm shift for us in the archaeology profession, and we tend to think about major innovative developments like the introduction of radiocarbon dating as shifting things forward significantly when the whole kind of landscape of our field changes. But I really don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to think of that in terms of the development of an application of LiDAR generally too, because it really does change how you think about planning archaeological fieldwork and the kind of information you get back from it. And really, this has sort of been brought to light quite starkly in southern Scotland recently. In 2020, just at the start of this year, the Scottish Government released the Phase 3 LiDAR dataset, which, as you can see on this image on the right-hand side of the slide here, really is getting to the stage where it covers most of southern Scotland. There's some blank areas, but largely there's pretty good coverage, certainly for much of the lowlands, and also some of the sort of upland moorland in southern Scotland. So if you're doing any kind of research or planning a project of any kind, there's a pretty good chance you're going to have access for free to a really high quality 3D data set. And that has major implications about how you on how you think about planning that project and the kind of things you'll get out of it. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about LiDAR itself. I mean, for various reasons, partly because it's becoming much more familiar to everyone now. I think that most people have seen the application of LiDAR, certainly in archaeology. There's even regular TV shows demonstrating how powerful it is. But it's equally significant in its contribution, whether you're working in somewhere like Mesoamerica, looking at, for remains underneath the canopy of rainforests, or in the uplands of Scotland. The kind of information that we can get from this kind of high quality data is really quite something. And these are just sort of good examples of projects we've worked in the south of Scotland, one of which is ongoing at the moment, which I'll say a little bit more about later briefly. But you can see that the kind of value of this stuff stands for itself. I mean, just having this new information about well-known sites and well-surveyed sites gives you a new angle on looking at them, and a new information always comes out. And obviously the major advantage of LiDAR is that this isn't imagery, this isn't photography. So this is 3D data that can be manipulated, reworked, reprocessed, and new information will come out of it. And just to kind of give an illustration of that, this is a simple hillshade of a fort in East Lothian, but by some fairly simple enhancement techniques on the way that data is rendered, you get so much more information out of it. You see internal features within the fort now. And if those of you have got big enough screens, you might just about pick out the possible traces of a palisade slot. Again, completely invisible in standard photography, but the kind of thing that gets pulled out of the manipulation of this 3D data. But as I say, I don't really want to talk too much about LiDAR itself, but more to think about how it's going to impact on what we know about the archaeology we look at, and how we can plan to find out more. And I think it's really important to look at the patterns of previous field surveys. These two maps here are published by members of staff at HES, and they just kind of depict the major field campaigns that were undertaken by the Royal Commission prior to its incorporation in the new HES. And you can see quite clearly that the coverage is by no means blanket. The map on the left here is field projects taken after 1987. And in George Geddes' paper, when he was looking at the marginal land survey, he's mapped out the areas that were surveyed in the earlier part of the 20th century. And you can see that, when we're talking about the Northern Highlands, certainly you're having to go back to the early part of the 20th century, back to Curll's day, to get really kind of blanket coverage of these sort of landscape scale surveys. And for much of the Highlands, there's really not been systematic survey undertaken at all on a landscape scale. So you can see these kind of really condition what we know about these areas, and also it's important to think about the way that surveys have worked in the past, whereby the Royal Commission would put labels on things and classifications on things based on their understanding of the archaeology of that area. And it's just worth reflecting that when you have such incomplete coverage, that it's quite feasible that we should be thinking about major overhauls of a lot of our sort of conventional wisdom. And I think that's something that LiDAR is really going to bring forward. Another thing to think about is why we have LiDAR and why we might get it in the future. And one of the first things to say is that this isn't something that's just going to come flooding through and we're all just going to get access to eventually. It's always commissioned for a specific reason. And you can see on the map on the right here, this is the existing open data on the Scottish Government website, which is freely available to download. And you can see where the early phases of LiDAR survey have all followed these floodplains, and basically that's because the data was collected for the purposes of flood modelling, for flood alleviation schemes and that kind of thing. So it's basically for SEPA's use and for government use. The phase 3 data set, which is restricted to effectively south of the central belt, that was commissioned for monitoring power networks, for overhead cables and that kind of thing, and also a collaboration between some local authorities filling in gaps in the data. But it's not necessary to pause too long on the reasons for the data being collected. But I just wanted to flag up that it is possible to collaborate on the design of these projects, and when they come online for all the stakeholders, people that could make use of the data, to make that known, so that the data is made as available as possible, and that can and does happen. So it's something that should be shared, and that's something that we should be aspiring to. One source of LiDAR data for the Highlands so far has been some wind farm developments. Again, it's the renewable energy sector collecting this data for various reasons. Obviously, the microtopographic data that they get from it is very valuable in planning, for planning purposes, but also because it provides such a spectacularly useful baseline record of archaeological sites. So this is an example from the Bailey Hill wind farm. This high resolution is a 25 centimetre elevation model of the cairns at Knockfrickaden. And again, you can see that I don't need to explain to the archaeologists listening to this talk that the value of having this data, just the information we can get just purely from this, these kind of baseline records, new features coming from well-known sites on quite a regular basis. But also the new discoveries, areas that people haven't walked over, or at least if they have, they've missed these slight features, some of which are things fairly ephemeral traces, like the remains of hut circles and field systems, but also including quite substantial structures, like this is a very chunky building in the Bailey Hill wind farm dataset, which may well be a broch in Caithness. So, you know, the really quite substantial and significant monuments come to light through this data. But again, I want to kind of think more tonight about the value of the data beyond just the discoveries that we're going to make. It's always nice to find new cairns, new hut circles, new field systems. But I think that to make the most of this data, archaeologists need to be thinking about the strategy in a new way. So for the first time, rather than having to rely on paper maps and existing HERs, some of which were compiled from records many decades old, if not getting on for a century old now, we're able to look at the landscape on a big scale and plan how we might find out more about that landscape based on what we can see. So that means that we're able to target areas for prospective survey, things like geophysics, field walking and test pitting. And by modelling the distributions of archaeological sites and activity, find spots against this sort of micro-topographic background. And we're building up a much more nuanced understanding of how the landscape comes to look the way it does. And I think, again, it's important to think about what archaeologists have traditionally classified things as being. We talk about marginal land in archaeology, and that being where the archaeological survival is likely to be highest. But I think that's certainly a concept that we need to be thinking about challenging. Is it always the case that the most archaeological sites turn up on the least touched land? Do they always turn up on the marginal fringes? The more I look at LiDAR and the more I work with it, the more I'm starting to think that that's probably not the case, and that the levels of survival that we see and the levels of potential aren't always directly related to the levels of subsequent agricultural activity. And really, I think looking at things like the sort of micro-topography and the micro-environment of individual sites is really well worth doing, using this LiDAR data to kind of get the most out of the potential of these sites. The other thing that's obvious that, again, is going to stand to reason is that we'll be able to think about filling in some of the holes in our knowledge, some of the major gaps that are yet to be filled. And I say all this in advance of there being large-scale LiDAR data sets for the Highlands. So this is speculative stuff, but the kind of thing that we should be hoping and expecting LiDAR to give us in the coming years and decades are the significant gaps that we can't put our fingers on. And particularly things like the very ephemeral types of site, things that don't survive particularly well, that are difficult to spot in the landscape when you're doing traditional field walking. Things like perhaps Neolithic settlements, buildings that are almost entirely turf and timber. I think we can well expect to find more of these. Equally, gaps in the settlement landscape from the historic period. You know, it's easy to point to to medieval settlement, but can we start to tease out the characteristics of early medieval settlement from later medieval settlement in rural parts of the Highlands? Something that's difficult to do at the moment, but with large-scale mapping and large-scale modelling of the landscape context, that may become much more feasible. And I also think that it should be easier to find functionally specific sites. So when you have the topography, you have the flood and drainage models to work with. Sites like mills and kilns, tracks and fords, the kind of things that we don't have an awful lot of archaeological research on in rural Scotland, should be easily studyable. And not only that, but we should be able to predict where these things will turn up based on the topographic logic behind their position. This concept of topographic logic is one that I think about a lot, and anyone who's done archaeological survey, as many of the people listening to this have, I know, you'll know that when you're surveying, you tend to start to develop a feeling for the area you're working in. You know the types of landscape that you're likely to find a hut circle, where a burnt mound is going to turn up, where you could expect to find a relic prehistoric field system, that kind of thing. But I think that LiDAR gives us the opportunity to kind of test that, because I'm always very wary of this idea of conventional wisdom. And as pioneering and as invaluable as the work that the Commission did in the 20th century, the Royal Commission, it has also constrained our thinking into a series of categories and boxes, that you only find these types of sites in these locations. And if you find a site in this location, it must be one of these. And the more you look at LiDAR and the more you work with LiDAR as a tool for landscape archaeology, the more you start to get an understanding that there's lots of sites that break these rules, and it leaves you scratching your head. And to me, I think that this is one of the most exciting areas for the application of LiDAR survey, because we can start to look at these things that don't fit our models. Like, why is there a fort in a place that we shouldn't find a fort, for example? Are there burnt mounds with no obvious water sources nearby, this kind of thing. And I think that needs to force us into looking at our thinking and examining our logic about why we're putting certain sites into particular boxes. A good example of this was a site or a project that I've talked about before, and this came off the back of the availability of the Bailey Hill Wind Farm dataset. And this was a community project with the group at Castletown Heritage Society, where we looked at as many of the hut circles, the Bronze Age sites, basically hut circles, burnt mounds, that kind of thing, field systems across the dataset, and went out and surveyed many of these sites. And chose a couple for detailed survey and excavation. So we did test pitting for soil analysis and trial excavation on a couple of these structures. And one of the things that brought to light this site on the left-hand side of this slide here is at scale, just near Bailey Hill itself. And we put trenches over what appeared to be a burnt mound next to a hut circle. And we were sort of right. This is certainly a Bronze Age settlement, but the structure that we had classified as the burnt mound turned out to be a turf-built building, and the structure that we had designated as a hut circle probably was a hut circle, but it had almost certainly begun life as a burnt mound. So they'd shoveled, the builders had shoveled out all this burnt material to create a structure out of this thing. So it really illustrates how, just by scratching the surface of these sites that LiDAR brings to light, you can really start to develop a bit more of a refined understanding of the logic behind these settlements. So just kind of to kind of bring things to a close, there's a few things I just wanted to mention and where we might go with this kind of data. And the first thing is to say that there's way too much of it. And that's particularly going to be the case when we get close to the stage where we have blanket coverage of LiDAR in Scotland. I cannot conceive that we'll be anywhere near mapping all of it in my lifetime. Even the data that's available to us for southern Scotland now, and it's by no means the highest resolution data that will ever be collected, is already throwing up way too many features, way too many possible sites that need investigated than could ever be dealt with in 100 careers. So there's so much to do, so many angles to take on this stuff. Whether it's looking at the recent agricultural landscape, whether it's medieval settlement, or whether it's really early prehistoric settlement of the landscape, there's just too much of it. So that really lends itself to opening up branches for collaboration on concerted research efforts in particular parcels, so that we build up this really coherent understanding of the landscape. And LiDAR is great for this because it can all be put online, it can all be shared, everyone can download it and look at these sites themselves. Just by way of an example, I'd point you towards a project I've been working on with colleagues at AOC and Scottish Borders Council and East Lothian Council on some of this data from the Phase 3 data set. And this is based around the Whitadder river catchment, which runs through the Lammermuirs. And basically what that involved was putting all of this data online, integrating it with the fantastic resources that you can get access to through the National Library of Scotland, HER data from both the local authorities and from HES, and compiling this all into one web map that anyone can access. And that just allows you to zoom into this LiDAR data, look at features that you think might be of interest, and tag them on the map and submit them to the project for further research. And I really think that initiatives like this, although we're kind of in the very early stages of figuring out how all this sort of stuff can work, how we can manage this data, and how we can marshal it into coherent and valuable research projects, this really seems like a way forward to me. Because there's always so much to find and people will always see new things in the data. So this kind of map research, comparing it to HER data, the kind of thing that Dave Cowley and his team are doing at the moment with the RAMP project at HES, we're going to see more of in the future, and everyone has a stake and everyone has a role to play in this. And that's really all I wanted to say. So thank you all for listening, and I'd be happy to have any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Graeme. That was fascinating. It is actually kind of overwhelming when you see how much information we have already and how much is going to be there. Kind of to start the ball rolling, from my point of view, I've got a quick question about planning applications. I'm assuming the cost is quite high at the moment, but I assume it's coming down. So at the moment we can justify asking for LiDAR for extensive applications like wind farms and things like that. Do you think it's going to come down where it might be possible to ask for small housing developments or something like that, or is it always going to be better to do the large scale surveys?
No, you're absolutely right, and already LiDAR being acquired by drone is being done routinely now, and that's something that was often thought of as like one of the holy grails. If we can start doing small areas for using drones to capture the data, then we'd be able to do it much more routinely for small sites, as you say, because one of the things about the acquisition cost is that if you're going to pay for the aircraft to get up there and take the data, it may as well survey a few hundred kilometers, because once you've got it there, it can do that in a day. But it's quite a big cost to get the airplane in the sky to begin with. But you're right, the prices are coming down. Even the cost of airplane acquired LiDAR is quite a lot lower than it used to be. But also, I think you're right that drone applications of LiDAR are going to be much more routine, and we're going to see that smaller scale projects too. I think that one of the things, just to finish that answer, is that it will be quite key to make sure that there's some central way of managing this data. You know, it's only going to be valuable if we can access the data from one place and see it as a seamless data set. And that's what's so great about what's happening in Scotland and to an extent in England as well, where all of this data is being made available online.
That's great. Thank you. You actually preempted one of our questions there from Roland Spencer Jones about, is it going to be possible to do it by drone? So the answer to that is yes. And I'm wondering now whether NOSAS are going to have plans to buy a drone and all the equipment themselves. And that would be great if you want to get on that. Anyone to jump in on that one. I've got another question here from Duncan Kennedy. Is there much data that's been collected but not made available, or is it all accessible fairly swiftly, whatever the source?
There is data that has been collected and not been made available. It's very hard to know the full extent of that because it's collected by private companies for their own commercial reasons, and they might do that because they're planning a project and they want to know about the topography in detail. By and large, I think that when it's something like a large-scale landscape survey that's being done for modelling something like wind flow patterns across a landscape, then quite often the early surveys that were done by private companies were quite low resolution. All they were after was sort of gross morphology of the landscape, and that's not such good for so much good for archaeology. I think increasingly it tends to be more collaborative now. So the data from southern Scotland has come about because the energy network collaborated with SEPA and the government and the local authorities to an extent to make sure that everybody would be able to use this data. I think something that people were often worried about when LiDAR first started being used was that everyone would commission their own surveys for their own reasons, when actually it's the same data, everyone can use it, you know, so it makes sense for everyone to pull together and say, you know, we can all use this if we collect it and share it. So I think that's something we as archaeologists should be shouting loud about, because we need to be not forgotten when people are talking about commissioning stuff.
Yes, definitely. I mean, one of the questions we had was from Nick Lindsay. How do we access the surveys indicated on your slide 2 showing the Scottish Government? Is that fairly obvious to find, or would you need to know a specific website?
No, I mean, you can find it easily by Googling. It's the Scottish Remote Sensing Portal. And if you Google that, then you'll find it as an interactive map. And basically what that does is give you access to the source data. I mean, you can even literally download the source point clouds, so the individual measurements. You'd need quite a powerful computer to process it, but it's there if you want it. Or you can download the pre-processed tiles, the elevation models, for small areas. About, I think they're 5 kilometer tiles that you can download, and then you can just run your own analysis on them. You know, just free open source GIS software will do a good job with them.
That's great, thank you. Now I see someone has their hand up. It's Mr. Andrew Pulse. Would you like to ask your question directly, Andrew?
Thank you, Kirsty. Graeme, the LiDAR data is getting so good now, and we're seeing archaeological sites in such high resolution, features we didn't know existed, and we can tell so much more about them than we ever used to. Is this the beginning of the end of standard field archaeology?
No, I don't believe so. I think I spoke about this at a previous Highland conference when we were talking about. Sorry, I apologise. It might have been at the NOSAS conference, but about the idea of where survey will go in the light of all these new developments. And the fact is, there's never a substitute for looking at something on the ground, and there's never a substitute for making your mind up as to what the data is showing you. And it's also important to say that it's very easy for LiDAR to fool you. It can make things appear to be there which aren't there. So there will always be a requirement to go and stand on it and understand what it is you're looking at. Yeah, I mean, I think the way I think about LiDAR is it's another tool in your toolkit, you know, so when you're going out there, you're not having to guess whether you're you're following the right feature. You know, you can actually see it. You can be standing with it on an iPad or on your phone, and it can help you trace an earthwork which is really faint and ephemeral. So I don't believe it is the end of fieldwork at all. It's just another thing to help us do fieldwork better.
Thank you. We've got another question here from Jonathan Wordsworth. It's about the data that we have in Highlands. Certainly the SEPA data is fairly large scale and rather coarse. What's the prospect of higher resolution data being available in Highlands? Or, you know, do we need to sort of commission to get in on the act to be asking for kind of specific resolution that would aid looking for archaeology rather than looking at floodplains or something?
Yeah, I mean, that's the important thing. So when new data is being commissioned, that's kind of back to my earlier point that we need to be shouting and putting our hands up saying, if you're going to do it, make sure it's good enough for us to use too. Because in actual fact, it doesn't make too much difference to the acquisition costs, whether they're surveying at 25 centimeter resolution or whether they're surveying for 1 meter resolution. So that's definitely worth considering. The phase 1 data is coarse, but even at a 1 or 2 meter elevation model, you're pushing it for archaeology, but 1 meter is definitely usable. The Bailey Hill and the Burn of Wilk data sets were both half meter, and at Bailey Hill we have some 25 centimeter as well. And the phase 3 data set for southern Scotland is all surveyed, well, to produce a half meter elevation model, but you can push it by reprocessing it down to 25 centimeters quite easily. I think part of the answer to that question is that as the technology matures and as more of these surveys are commissioned, you're going to see the base resolution go up, so that it's a standard. You know, it's barely worth collecting a 1 or 2 meter data set these days. You might as well collect the 25 centimeter. But as to when we'll start to see these data sets come through in the Highlands, again, it depends on what the drivers are. But, you know, hopefully soon.
Thank you. Ian, are there any more questions coming in, or is there anything that I missed? Have you got your...
Sorry, yeah, I think we've covered the ones that are in the chat, I think.
Okay. Does anyone want to ask a question directly? Maybe put your hand up, the wee hand icon. Or any more questions for Graeme? I'll give you a minute to think about it. Okie dokie. Maybe we're done there. I think we're maybe overwhelmed by what there is. I mean, certainly it's the kind of thing that it's online and people can go and have a look at and pick things up at any time. It's going to be a kind of an overwhelming lifetime occupation if you have nothing else to do. I can easily see it can take over your life looking for sites. I know it can happen to us on a daily basis. So thank you, Graeme, especially for rushing back from the rainy Galloway to join us. And yes, thanks very much. And